Diesel fuel in your gas engine on purpose. That sentence alone is enough to make any mechanic drop their wrench and stare at you like you just said something in a foreign language. And honestly, that reaction makes total sense. Because from the day you first learned anything about cars, the golden rule has always been the same. Keep diesel and gasoline as far apart as possible. Different pumps, different nozzles, different everything. Mixing them up at the gas station is the kind of mistake that leaves you stranded on the side of the road with a very expensive tow truck bill. But here is the wild part. There is a small group of people out there, regular everyday car owners and old-school mechanics, who have been quietly pouring diesel fuel directly into their engine oil right before an oil change. Not into the gas tank, not into the fuel system, into the actual engine oil. And they swear it is one of the best things you can do for a dirty, sludge-filled engine. Now, before you close the tab and call that crazy, stick with me here. Because there is something real happening inside that engine that most people have never seen. Something that builds up slowly over years and years, completely invisible to you, eating away at your engine performance from the inside. And by the time most people figure out it is there, it has already done a lot of damage. We are talking about carbon buildup, sludge, varnish, the kind of thick, sticky, dark gunk that coats the inside of your engine over time like old grease on a forgotten frying pan. It clings to your pistons, your camshafts, your valve covers, the inside walls of your cylinders. It sits there, baking at high temperatures, hardening into crusty deposits that slowly choke the life out of your engine. And here is the thing that nobody really talks about. Your regular oil change does not clean this stuff out. Your engine flush from the auto parts store might help a little. But that deep, stuck-on, years-old carbon? It laughs at most of that stuff. It has been in there through hundreds of heat cycles, baked and rebaked until it becomes almost like a layer of cement on the inside of your engine. So when someone says, hey, pour some diesel in your oil and run it for an hour before you drain it, most people hear that and think it is a joke, a prank, something you tell a new apprentice to mess with them. But what if it actually works? That is exactly what we tested, and the results inside that engine were honestly shocking. The kind of before and after that makes you question everything you thought you knew about engine cleaning. We are going to walk you through the whole thing, what happened when we did it, what we found inside the engine after, and most importantly, what it actually means for your car. But first, you need to understand just how dirty an engine can get and why regular oil changes are not always enough. Before we go any further, if you are into real-world car experiments, the kind where we actually try the crazy stuff so you do not have to, hit that subscribe button right now. We do not just talk theory here. We get our hands dirty, we tear things apart, and we show you what is actually happening inside these engines. You will want to be here for what is coming next in this series, because things are going to get even more wild. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss one. Section 2. What is actually living inside your engine? To understand why this diesel experiment matters, you first have to understand what is going on inside your engine after years of use. Think about your engine like a kitchen. Every time you cook, little bits of oil splatter on the walls, on the burners, on the bottom of the pans. If you clean it regularly, it stays pretty manageable. But if you let it go for years without a deep clean, that grease hardens. It bakes on. It turns into this dark, sticky layer that you practically need a chisel to remove. And the longer you wait, the worse it gets. Your engine is doing the same thing, except the temperatures inside are way higher, and the mess is way worse. Every single time you run your engine, tiny amounts of fuel, combustion gases, and oil vapors mix together inside the crankcase. The oil circulates through the engine, picking up heat and tiny particles as it goes. Over time, the oil starts to break down. It thickens. It oxidizes. It turns into a dark sludge that sticks to every surface it touches. On top of that, the combustion process itself creates carbon. When fuel burns inside your cylinders, It does not burn 100% perfectly every single time. Small amounts of unburned fuel and combustion byproducts get past the piston rings and end up in the oil. This is called blowby, and it is completely normal. Every engine does it. But those byproducts get cooked at high temperatures, and over time they turn into hard carbon deposits. These deposits build up in a few key places. They coat the tops of your pistons, which are already dealing with some of the highest temperatures in the entire engine. They collect around your intake valves, which are supposed to open and close cleanly to let air into the cylinders. They form inside your valve cover, where the oil circulates around your camshafts and rocker arms. They even settle in the oil pan at the very bottom of the engine, sitting below the crankshaft. Now here is where it starts affecting how your car actually runs. When carbon builds up on your pistons, it takes up space inside the cylinder. Less space means higher compression. Higher compression sounds like a good thing, but when it goes too far, it can cause your engine to knock and ping, which is a fast track to serious engine damage. When carbon collects on your intake valves, it actually blocks the flow of air into the cylinder. Less air means less power. The engine has to work harder to do the same job. You start noticing your car feeling a little sluggish, a little rough at idle, maybe a little less fuel efficient than it used to be. And when sludge builds up in your oil passages, it restricts oil flow. Oil is the lifeblood of your engine. Every moving part depends on a thin film of oil to keep metal from rubbing directly on metal. When sludge starts blocking those passages, oil pressure drops. Parts that should be coated in oil start running dry. And once that happens, wear accelerates fast. The scary part is that none of this happens overnight. It is so gradual that most people never notice until something goes wrong. By then, the engine has thousands of miles of dirty, sludgy buildup that regular oil changes alone cannot undo. So what do you do about it? Well, the car industry has some solutions. There are engine flush products that you can add to your old oil, run the engine for a few minutes, then drain everything out. These work to a degree on light buildup. There are special cleaning oil additives you can mix in. And for really serious cases, there are professional cleaning treatments that involve spraying cleaning chemicals directly into the intake manifold while the engine is running, which is a whole different level of aggressive. But one of the oldest tricks in the book, the one that keeps coming up in old-school mechanic communities, farm shops, and backyard garages, is diesel fuel. Not diesel in the gas tank. Diesel mixed into the engine oil, run for a short time, then drained out along with all the mess it loosens up. The theory behind it is actually pretty simple. Diesel fuel is a very good solvent. It is great at dissolving greasy, oily, carbon-based deposits. And because it is similar enough to engine oil that the two mix together, you can combine them in the engine, let the mixture circulate, and have the diesel do the cleaning work while the oil keeps everything lubricated. The question is whether it actually works, and whether it does more damage than good. To find out, we picked a Toyota Camry with a genuinely dirty engine. High mileage, real carbon buildup, real sludge. The kind of engine that shows you exactly what years of deposits look like. And we ran the diesel flush experiment from start to finish, measuring everything we could before and after. Here is what we found. Section 3. The experiment nobody wanted to try. First things first. Before we poured a single drop of diesel into that engine, we needed a real baseline. Something to compare against after the experiment was done. Because the whole point of this was not just to try something wild, it was to find out if it actually worked, with real numbers and real visuals to back it up. So we started with a compression test on all 4 cylinders. If you have never done a compression test before, here is how it works. You pull the spark plugs out, thread a pressure gauge into each spark plug hole, crank the engine over, and read how much pressure builds up inside the cylinder. Healthy cylinders should all be in a similar range. Low compression usually means worn rings or worn valves. Cylinders that are significantly different from each other can point to serious problems. On this Camry, Cylinder number 1 came in at around 135 to 137 psi. Cylinder 2 was right around 140. Cylinder 3 pushed up to about 150. And cylinder 4 was just a tick over 150, maybe 155. We ran through all 4 cylinders twice just to make sure the numbers were consistent, and they were pretty close both times. Those numbers told us a few things. The engine was running, but the compression was a little lower on the front 2 cylinders compared to the back 2. Not dramatically different, but noticeable. Real-world engine stuff. Next, we pulled the valve cover off to get a look at what we were working with on the inside. And wow, the inside of that valve cover was not pretty. There was thick, dark buildup coating the cam lobes. The spark plug tubes had heavy staining all the way down. Right where the PCV valve enters the system, there was a concentration of sludge and carbon that had been sitting there long enough to get crusty. In the back of the cylinder head, where the 2 cam gears meet, you could see actual chunks of dark deposits. Not just a film, actual chunks. We also checked oil pressure before the experiment, threading a mechanical gauge into the block where the oil pressure sending unit lives. With fresh 10W30 in the engine at a cold start, oil pressure was hanging right around 65 to 70 psi. That is a healthy number for a cold engine. Good baseline. Then we crawled under the car, drained all the oil out, and before we closed the drain plug back up, we stuck a camera through the oil pan to get a look at the underside of the crankshaft. What we saw was exactly what you would expect from a high-mileage engine that had been through a lot. The crankshaft had a coat of carbon and varnish on it. Not catastrophic, but definitely dirty. Dark, baked-on buildup covering the surfaces that are supposed to be relatively clean. All right, so now we had our before pictures, our before numbers, and our baseline. Time to do the thing. We put a fresh oil filter on the engine. That part is important, and we will come back to it in a second. Then we added about 2.5 quarts of fresh 10W30 motor oil, and then we poured in roughly 2 quarts of diesel fuel, half oil, half diesel. The engine now had a 50-50 mix of motor oil and diesel fuel running through it. And yes, just looking at that on the dipstick, knowing what was in there, felt a little bit unhinged. It smelled like diesel when you pulled the cap off. It was noticeably thinner and lighter than normal oil. It looked almost watery on the dipstick compared to what fresh oil usually looks like. We pushed the car outside the shop because honestly, running an experiment like this indoors when you're not sure if the engine is going to start shooting things out of the block felt like a really bad idea, and started it up. The engine fired right up. No coughing, no sputtering, nothing dramatic. It just ran. We sat and watched it for about 14 minutes to let it get up to operating temperature. Once it was warm, we went back and checked the oil pressure. Warm idle with that diesel mixture in there was sitting at around 20 to 25 psi. Now, that is lower than the 65 to 70 we saw with cold, straight oil. But you also have to account for the fact that warm oil always has lower pressure than cold oil. The heat makes it thinner, and it flows more easily. The real question was whether the pressure was in a safe range. And for a warm idling engine, somewhere between 20 and 30 psi at idle is generally considered acceptable territory, though it is definitely on the lower end. We let it run for a full hour, an entire hour with half diesel, half motor oil, circulating through every oil passage, every bearing, every moving part in that engine. The diesel mixture was reaching the cam lobes, the main bearings, the rod bearings, the oil pump, the cylinder head, all of it. When the hour was up, we shut it off and pulled it back into the shop. Here is where things got interesting. We went to take the new oil filter off first, and when we cracked it loose, barely any oil dripped out of it. The filter was almost completely dry inside. That was not expected. A used oil filter should be pretty full of oil. The fact that this one was nearly empty was a little concerning. The old filter we had just replaced before the experiment still had oil in it. But this new one that had been running with the diesel mixture for an hour? Almost nothing. The best explanation is that the diesel oil mix was thin enough that as soon as the engine shut off, it drained back out of the filter almost immediately. Oil filters usually stay pretty full after shutdown because normal oil is thick enough to stay put. But this mixture was so thin that it just ran right back out. The good news is that when we cut the filter open later, it was clear that oil had absolutely been flowing through it during operation. There was plenty of evidence of that. But we will get to that in a second. We drained the oil out of the pan and started looking at what came out. The stuff that drained out was thin, almost like water, and it was definitely not the clean color you see when you drain fresh oil. It had a brown tint to it, and when we looked at it under better light, it was noticeably darker than what went in. Something had come off the inside of that engine. Then we opened up that oil filter, and that is when the experiment really revealed itself. Section 4. What we found inside changed everything. Cutting open a used oil filter is always interesting. The filter element traps everything that the oil picks up as it circulates through the engine. Metal particles, debris, carbon flakes, all of it gets caught in the filter media before the oil goes back through the engine. Cutting one open is basically like reading a report card on what is going on inside your engine. On a normal oil change with a healthy engine, you might find very fine particles and a slight discoloration of the filter media. Not much to look at. Maybe a little grayish staining from normal wear particles. What we found in this filter was not that. When we peeled back the filter media and got a good look at what was trapped in there were actual chunks of carbon. Not a fine powder, not a light dusting. Actual visible chunks of dark carbon deposits that had broken loose from somewhere inside the engine and been carried through the oil to the filter. And right there among the carbon chunks, there were metal flakes. Shiny, bright metal flakes. The kind that reflect light when you move them around. The kind that come from bearing surfaces being worn or washed away. Now, finding metal flakes in an oil filter is not automatically a death sentence for an engine. Every engine produces some very fine metal particles through normal wear. That is what the oil filter is there to catch. But finding shiny, visible metal flakes after running a diesel flush for an hour was a signal worth paying attention to. What likely happened is that the diesel oil mixture was thin enough that it was not protecting the bearing surfaces as well as full-weight oil would. Bearings depend on a film of oil to keep the metal surfaces separated. When that oil film gets too thin, metal can contact metal and you start getting accelerated wear. An hour of running at a 50-50 diesel ratio is a long time to be doing that. The carbon chunks, though, those were exactly what you want to find. That was the whole point of the experiment. And they were there, clear as day, big flakes of carbon that had been stuck to the inside of that engine for who knows how long, now broken free and caught in the filter. We put the camera back up into the oil pan to compare before and after. The difference was visible. Remember those dark, baked-on deposits we saw on the crankshaft before we started? The carbon coating that covered the surfaces we could see in the pan? Some of that was gone. The surfaces looked noticeably cleaner. Not perfect, not like a brand new engine, but clearly cleaner than they were before the diesel went in. Then we pulled the valve cover off again and looked at the top end. Same story. The cam lobes, which were heavily varnished before, looked less coated. That discoloration on the spark plug tubes was reduced. The deposits in the back of the head near the cam gears were not completely gone, but they were clearly less thick. The area around the PCV entry, which had been one of the worst spots for buildup, showed improvement. Was the engine spotless? No. Not even close. But the diesel had clearly done something. It had reached all of that built-up gunk, softened it up, broken pieces of it loose, and carried it out through the oil system, where it either got trapped in the filter or drained out with the oil. The next thing we did was run a fresh compression test, just to see if the numbers had changed at all. Cylinder 1 came in at about 150 psi, up from 135 before. Cylinder 2 was also at 150. Cylinder 3 was 155. Cylinder 4 was around 156 to 158. All 4 cylinders went up. Now, before you get too excited about those compression numbers, there is an important catch. Before the experiment, the compression test was done on a cold engine. After the experiment, the engine was still warm when we retested. And warm engines generally produce higher compression readings than cold ones, because the heat causes the metal to expand slightly and create a tighter seal between the rings and the cylinder wall. So some of that compression increase was almost certainly just from the engine being warm. It would be dishonest to claim with total certainty that the diesel flush freed up stuck piston rings and added compression. Could it have contributed a little? Maybe. But the temperature difference between the 2 tests makes it impossible to say for sure. What we can say is that the compression did not go down. Running with a thin diesel mix for an hour did not cause any sudden drop in cylinder pressure, which is at least a sign that nothing catastrophic happened to the rings during the experiment. After the diesel oil was drained completely, we filled the engine back up with fresh, clean 10W30 and no diesel. Straight motor oil, the way it is supposed to be. We ran the engine again, let it come up to full operating temperature, and then checked the oil pressure one more time. With straight 10W30 in there, warm idle oil pressure came back up to right around 30 psi. That is noticeably higher than the 20 to 25 we were seeing with the diesel mixture, which makes complete sense. Thicker oil holds pressure better, especially at idle when the pump is not spinning very fast. The engine was not ticking. It was not knocking. It was not doing any of the bad sounds that would suggest bearing damage or oil starvation. It just ran, quietly and smoothly, the same way it had been running before the experiment started. So the big question, does it work? Yes, it absolutely does clean the engine. The evidence inside that filter and inside that oil pan and inside that valve cover is very clear. Diesel fuel mixed into the engine oil does loosen up carbon deposits, carry sludge out, and leave the inside of the engine noticeably cleaner than it was before. But does it come at a cost? Also yes. And this part is just as important as the cleaning results. Section 5. The real cost and what it means for your car. Here is the honest, straightforward version of what happened in this experiment and what it means for you as a car owner. The diesel flush worked, but it worked the way a very aggressive tool works, like using a pressure washer to clean a delicate surface. Yeah, the dirt comes off. But you have to be okay with accepting that you might be pushing the limits of what that surface can handle. Let us talk about why. When diesel fuel mixes with engine oil, it does a few things. First, it dramatically thins the oil. Motor oil is specifically designed to have a certain thickness at operating temperature. That thickness is what allows it to create and maintain a protective film between moving metal parts. Bearings, for example, are precision-machined surfaces that depend on a thin but consistent layer of oil to keep the metal from touching metal directly. The clearances in a modern engine bearing are incredibly tight. We are talking thousandths of an inch. And the oil film that protects those surfaces is even thinner. When you add diesel to the oil, you are diluting that protective film. You are making it thinner and less effective. At 50-50, the oil becomes almost as thin as water at operating temperature. And water is terrible at protecting bearings. This is why we found metal flakes in the filter. Now, in a short-term situation, the damage from an hour of running like this might be pretty minimal, especially if the engine was already in decent shape. But if you ran that mixture for longer, or if the engine already had worn bearings with larger clearances that depend more heavily on oil pressure to stay lubricated, the outcome could be much worse. There is also the question of how much diesel to use. In this experiment, we went with a 50-50 mix. That is aggressive. A lot of people in the mechanic community who have actually used this technique on their own vehicles talk about using much smaller amounts, like a quart of diesel added to 4 quarts of oil, maybe a half quart. At those smaller ratios, the oil is still thin, but not nearly as dramatically thinned as it is at 50-50. The duration matters too. Running for a full hour at 50-50 is pushing the limits hard. Some people who use this technique say they add a small amount of diesel, drive the car for 10 to 15 minutes at highway speeds to get the oil fully up to temperature, then immediately drain everything. Not an hour. 15 minutes. There is a big difference in how much wear accumulates between 15 minutes and 60 minutes of thin oil. So if you are thinking about trying this, and we want to be very clear that we are not telling you to try it, the lower the ratio and the shorter the runtime, the lower the risk. But the cleaning effect might also be less dramatic. There is also a big difference between doing this on an older engine headed for retirement and doing it on your daily driver that you need to commute in every day. The Camry in this experiment was already at end-of-life territory. A test like this on a car you depend on to get to work is a very different calculation. And what about modern engines? Here is where we want to be really direct. Modern engines, especially anything from the last 10 to 15 years, are far more precision-built than engines from 20 or 30 years ago. Tolerances are tighter, oil passages are smaller, variable valve timing systems depend on very specific oil pressure to function correctly. Turbocharged engines are even more sensitive to oil quality because the turbocharger runs at extreme temperatures and depends almost entirely on the oil to keep it alive. Putting a diesel mix through a modern turbocharged engine is a gamble with much higher stakes than doing it on an older, simpler, naturally aspirated engine. The cleaning benefit does not change much, but the risk of causing damage to precision components, oil pressure-sensitive timing systems, or the turbocharger goes up significantly. The real alternative for modern engines, if you are concerned about carbon buildup, is a lot simpler. Change your oil more often. Use quality oil. If your car specifies synthetic, use full synthetic. If you mostly do short trips around town, change the oil more frequently because short trips are actually harder on oil than highway driving. The engine never fully warms up on a short trip, condensation builds up in the oil, and it degrades faster. If you do have significant carbon buildup on a direct injection engine, there are professional induction cleaning services that spray cleaning solution into the intake to help remove valve deposits. These are much more targeted than a diesel flush and much less risky. But here is the bottom line on the diesel experiment. If you have an older engine, a high-mileage vehicle that you are not worried about damaging, and you want to try to knock out some of that years-old buildup before a rebuild, or before selling it, or just as a last-ditch effort to see if you can wake it back up, then a small amount of diesel mixed into the old oil for a short runtime before draining is genuinely effective. The results in this experiment were real. The carbon came out, the engine looked cleaner inside, and when we refilled with fresh oil, it ran perfectly normally. But this is not a trick for routine maintenance. It is not something you do every oil change. It is not a substitute for keeping up with regular oil changes. And it is absolutely not something we would do on a modern daily driver without a very specific and compelling reason. Now let us tie this all back together and talk about what actually matters for keeping your engine clean long-term. The single best thing you can do for the inside of your engine is the thing everyone always says, but not enough people actually do. Change the oil on time, every time. Not a little late, not when you get around to it. On time. Engine oil has one job, and it does that job incredibly well until it starts to break down. Fresh oil is slippery, clean, and full of additives that protect against wear, oxidation, and corrosion. Old oil that has been through too many heat cycles starts losing those properties. It thickens, it gets acidic, the additives get used up. And as those additives wear out, the oil starts leaving deposits instead of cleaning them. Engines that get regular oil changes on a consistent schedule build up dramatically less carbon and sludge over their lifetime than engines that go too long between changes. It is not even close. A well-maintained engine that has seen regular oil changes at proper intervals looks completely different inside than one that has been neglected. We have cut them both open. The difference is almost hard to believe. If you have a newer engine and you are already doing regular oil changes with quality oil, you honestly do not need diesel flushes or ATF treatments or any of the other tricks. Your engine is probably in great shape inside, even if you cannot see it. If you have an older engine with questionable maintenance history and you want to try to clean it up, the more conservative route is to use a quality, commercially formulated engine flush product as directed, follow up with a fresh oil and filter change, then repeat the oil change again after a short break-in period to flush out any remaining loosened debris. It is not as dramatic as pouring diesel in there, but it carries a lot less risk. Now, for the specific question of what to do right before an oil change, the general concept behind using a cleaning agent in the old oil before you drain it is sound. The idea is that you introduce the cleaning agent while the oil is still in there, let it circulate and break things loose, and then drain all of it out together. Whether you use a commercial flush product, a small amount of ATF, or diesel fuel, the mechanism is similar. The difference is in how aggressive the cleaner is and how much risk it carries. Diesel is on the aggressive end. It cleans well, but it thins the oil significantly. Commercial flush products are formulated to be effective without being as harsh on bearings. A TF, which we tested in a previous experiment, sits somewhere in the middle. What we can tell you from hands-on testing is that all three of these approaches do actually clean the engine to some degree. The question is always whether the benefit outweighs the risk for your specific situation. And the answer to that question depends entirely on the age of your engine, its current condition, how long you are planning to keep the vehicle, and how comfortable you are with a calculated risk in the name of science or curiosity. Because at the end of the day, curiosity is why we are all here. The same curiosity that made us pour diesel into that engine oil is the same thing that makes car people open up engines and look inside, tear apart gearboxes to see how they work, and try experiments that every textbook says you should not try. Sometimes those experiments confirm what you expected, sometimes they surprise you, and sometimes they reveal something genuinely useful that changes how you think about the machine you have been driving all your life. The inside of that Camry after the diesel flush, that surprised us. The cleaning was more noticeable than we expected. The risk was also more real than we expected. Both of those things are worth knowing. And that is exactly the kind of real, hands-on information that we are always going to bring you here. So there you have it. Diesel fuel in your engine oil. Does it clean? Absolutely yes. Is it risky? 100%? Would we do it on a daily driver? Probably not. Would we do it again on an old beater headed for the junkyard just to see what happens? Honestly, yeah. Probably. The Camry is still running, by the way. No thrown rods, no knocking. Fresh oil in it, everything back to normal. She is still alive to fight another day, and we have more tests coming for her. If this video opened your eyes to what is actually going on inside your engine, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than most people realize. And if you want to be here for the next experiment, subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss it. We have more tests on this engine coming, and based on the comments from the ATF video, you all have a lot more ideas we have not tried yet. Speaking of which, what do you want us to try next? Drop it in the comments below. What is the craziest thing you have ever heard of someone putting in an engine oil? Let us know, and we just might test it. See you in the next one.